Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I was going to do just a fun video about comics, and then something really happened over the week which I feel like I just have to talk about. And it may be a little bit from the comments that I got on my video last week, but I think it's more about the state of the world right now. Because I've been trying to focus on a little more positive things connected with comics so that I can segue a bit into my graphic novel, which is coming out soon. And by the way, the link is in the description for the coming soon page for my graphic novel. If you go there and leave your email address, you will be informed when the project goes live, and you will also receive a free exclusive pinup poster if you then decide to order the book later when the project does go live. But that's all I'm going to say about that today, because I want to go back to the idea of hero, which I've been skipping out on the last couple of videos. I want to talk about hero, but I'm going to get to that point at the very end of this video. I have to build up to it. And really, I'm looking at the condition of the world and saying, this is a world that despises heroes. And here's why. Now, if you want to take this as being my little rant, a very collected rant, but a rant nonetheless, you go right ahead. Because I think I'm probably going to tick more than a few people off with what I have to say about the current condition of the world. And I want to talk about that condition by looking at the historical. That's the rational way to do it. My first degree was in history. My first love was history, because mostly the story of history, but I studied history. And I want to look at history and how it has led to now. And a good place to start is a question that I got saying, how do I define progressivism? And why in the world am I so against it? And especially in avenues like comics where you can barely see it. Now, those are not my words. That's the words of my commenter. I can see it very well. Well, the answer to that question was actually answered by one of my subscribers. He said, listen, you talk about progressivism, it sounds like you're talking about communism. And I would say, yeah, if you want to make that leap from one to the other, you can certainly do so. And here's the reason why. Historically. Now, communism has sought, since its inception, to implant itself in various systems all over the world in order to get what it wants. And if you look at the material put out by the people who are trying to spread the communist revolution, you may see a lot of things which you may not necessarily at first think is connected to the idea of communism. The very idea of socialism for the communist is just a stepping stone in order to get to communism. This is in the foundational documents that they produced after taking over Russia and instituting the USSR and wanting to spread their glorious revolution all over the world. They said, well, look, we'll just put socialism in these countries. That's a stepping stone just to get to communism. That's all it is. So if you look at people like, say, Jordan White, who is an editor at Marvel, he edits most of the X-Men books, who says, I'm an avowed socialist. Well, he may not be someone who is trying to bring about communism, but he's a useful idiot. And yes, that's a technical term. He's a useful idiot. Because if he ever gets his way, and we get to the point of socialism, well, guess what? The communists are going to say, okay, now it's time to get to communism. We're not stopping here. We're continuing this train onwards. And so too it is with progressivism. Now, I ask the question, what exactly are you progressing towards? If you're progressivism, obviously you're progressing towards something. If you ask that question of progressives, they'll say, well, a better world, a more just world. But if you really press them and have them drill down to the very fundamentals of what this supposed better just world looks like, it looks like a communist utopia. But don't take my word for it. Let's go over this looking through the lens of history. Now, we'll start with Marvel Comics, which I go through intensely a lot of the time. And if you look at their podcasts and their statements and their articles that come out directly from Marvel itself, you will be hard-pressed to go through one of these things and not see some progressive talking points. Even if you go through the smaller ones, which talk about books coming out, you're going to hit that progressive language probably once or twice, at least. If you go to something like the Women of Marvel podcast, you will hear it a dozen times, repeat it over and over again. And these are key phrases and words, which seem to be commonplace, but they use in a very different way. And you can tell that they use them in a different way, because if you listen to the whole thing and try to put it together every time they use this specific word, you'll end up saying to yourself, what exactly do you mean by this word? Because it doesn't seem like you mean what the normal person would actually think this word means. And these would be words like diversity, inclusion, representation, empowerment, deconstruction, or more negative ones like systematic oppression or the patriarchy. Now again, these words can be used by normal people, most of them anyways, in a way which is completely different from how these quote-unquote progressive people at Marvel use these terms. And again, you can see this through many of the videos that I have put out, so I won't go through the entire argument here. You can certainly go back and look at some of the Women of Marvel podcasts that I've actually covered. When they use these words, they're using them in a very unique way, in a very progressive way. And that progressive way comes from an ideological mindset called critical gender theory. And as I have gone over in another video, which I'll link in the description, you can see where this comes from. It comes from feminism, and feminism gave it to other disciplines. They used critical gender theory to create critical race theory, and critical sexual theory, and a whole bunch of others. And again, in that older video, I show that, no, this is not me pulling this out of my hat. This is the history of feminism as told by feminists themselves, saying this is what we base things upon. And we need to, in their words, act as a virus to carry this kind of mentality into other disciplines and infect them with it so that they have their own version of it, which again is where critical race theory and critical sexual theory and all these other things come from. And if you look at critical gender theory, where it comes from in feminism, well, it comes from a thing called critical theory itself. And what exactly is critical theory? Well, as many have pointed out, it developed over decades, but really there was one central point wherein it was established, and that was the Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School was when a bunch of intellectuals got together in Frankfurt, Germany, I think it was in the early to mid-60s, and they had a very directed, specific point of coming up with an ideology. And their directed, specific point was they were avowed communists, and this is what they themselves declare, and they wanted to create an ideological mindset, a series of ideas that would continue the grand communist revolution. Because they realized at that point that their grand communist revolution was not going to take over the world. It had stalled, so they needed to restart it. Workers of the world unite simply did not cut it anymore, therefore they had to introduce it in a new way. And they wanted to introduce it into the intellectual sphere so that it eventually took over the institutions and did so in a way that destroyed the basis of everything that was opposed to communism. And again, this is not my interpretation of these events. This is what these people who created critical theory to begin with have stated themselves. And the point about critical theory is, what it does is, it criticizes something until it falls. It chips away at the foundation, little by little, the foundation of things, again, that are opposed to communism, which, when they fall, communism will then take over. This is the entire point of critical theory. You criticize something over and over again, relentlessly, until it falls. There is no such thing as constructive criticism within critical theory. It's all destructive. It is set towards the ends of destruction. Now, to get to the modern world with this, first we have to go back in history and see why Workers of the World Unite actually worked to begin with. And there are several places within history that I could focus on to explain this, but I'll focus on Russia, because I actually studied Russian history within my history degree. Now, the thing about Russia is, in its history, many historians believe and have stated that the only way that you can really rule Russia as it exists, because of its massive size, because it covers such a large swath of not only territory, but various kinds of territory and various kinds of people, the only way that you can actually keep this country together is through an iron fist. And if you look at the history of Russia, you will see that the people gradually came to accept this because they just realized that, look, I like my peace and security. If I want my peace and security, I need the government to stand. In order for the government to stand, it needs to actually rule pretty heavily. It needs to have a heavy hand over control. And this mindset, pervading for centuries of history, it produced a Russian people which, for a time, were very, very subservient. For a time, there were people who obeyed blindly. Now, very quickly, I don't want to say that all obedience is a bad obedience. I'm saying blind obedience is a bad obedience. There is obedience that actually works. You need obedience for a functioning military. But even then, you can't have blind obedience. This is what the Nuremberg trials have tried to teach us. They've tried to teach us by saying, look, these people are saying they were just following orders. They were being blindly obedient, therefore they cannot be held accountable for what they have done. And the court came back and said, no, you have a conscience. And your conscience would have told you that this is wrong. And even if it was going to come at a great personal sacrifice to you, you should have stood up and said, this is wrong. And since you have not done that, you have been complicit in all of this that has happened, and therefore you must be held accountable. So they're saying that blind obedience, even in the military, you can't have that. So again, what I'm talking about is blind obedience. This is the problem. And I'd like to give you a whole plethora of historic examples from Russia, but I don't have that time. So I'll just give you two. Now, if you look at the time of the great czars, if the czar came into any place, even remotely where you were, if they, say, perhaps wanted to take a drive in a carriage somewhere out into the country, if that carriage came anywhere within distance of you, you would have to drop to the ground immediately. And this, yes, was a time of absolute monarchs, but this is dropping to the ground, face down, on the ground, not moving. Everybody. And I'm sure that was very pleasant in the cold, harsh Russian environment. And everybody did this, again, because there was a kind of blind obedience. And my second example is skipping way forward, when I myself was studying Russian history. This was a time at least 10 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And yet, you got these documentaries of people in Russia who still had pictures of Stalin on their wall, and still revered him as a kind of saint. Why? Because even though the man was dead almost 50 years, they were showing that, look, this obedience that was beaten into them at that time has lasted this long, and they still won't give up on it, even though they now have access to the information showing that this man was a tyrant beyond tyrants. Now, just briefly, I want to say that I know I have a lot of people from Russia who actually listen to my videos, and I would say the Russian people now have gained for themselves a streak of disobedience, which is well-deserved, and I think, although it should be tempered, it is one that should be fostered. But my point being that the reason why communism took over in the very specific areas of the world that it did, like Russia, was because it had fertile ground to grow, and that fertile ground to grow was a blind obedience of the people. Because if you look at communism itself, the founding ideas of it, and how they are put together, they are not rational. This is not a rational ideology, nor is it one based upon the truth of reality, especially the truth of the reality of human existence. And so, in order for it to grow, it needs ignorance. It needs blind obedience of people to an arbitrary authority. And you see, the people of the Frankfurt School who came up with the idea of critical theory, they understood this very well. They understood that in order for communism actually to be restarted, their grand revolution to be restarted, it needed people to be ignorant. It needed people throughout the world to be blindly obedient. And this is what critical theory really at its heart does. It destroys not just institutions here and there, but what it's seeking to destroy at its fundamental base is to destroy all concepts of objective truth. Because if the people no longer have any concept of objective truth, then what do they got? Well, if they want peace and security, the only thing that they can depend upon is arbitrary authority. And in order for arbitrary authority to work, they need to have blind obedience to it. Because if they start to question it, this arbitrary authority falls apart. So if we skip forward to today and look at all these progressives, quote-unquote progressives, what they're doing is promoting critical theory. What this critical theory is doing, it is taking a hammer and just chipping away, very small, here and there, at the ideas that support any objective truth whatsoever. And some people have said to me, look, I don't see what you see in these comics, or in these science fiction and fantasy venues. I don't see it. Well, I would say, you don't see it because that's part of how critical theory is implemented. The long march through the institutions is long for a reason, because it's very, very slow. This chipping away is very subtle. It chips away sometimes just here and there at notions and ideas which we hold as fundamental truths. Now, I'm going to move on to a section of my argument which is probably the part that's going to tick people off. If we look around us today in the, well, to appease YouTube, let's just call it the health situation around the world today, what do we see happening? Well, we see an imposition of arbitrary authority in a way that they're saying to people, listen, you just need to shut up and obey now. These things are usually done by mandates, and mandates are laws, but they are laws that don't have a direct connection to the will of the people. Because they don't come from your legislature, it is the legislature that has appointed power to this individual so that this individual can make a mandate which actually has the enforcement of law. But that's not connected to the will of the people. And that, certainly in my estimation, makes it arbitrary. Certainly arbitrary if you want to impose those rules over me. Because if I have no say in these laws that you're making, then yeah, that's arbitrary and I would say unjust. And people throughout the world are being cracked down upon because they even dare to question what this arbitrary authority is telling them. So what are all these actions saying? They're saying, listen, people, you need to have blind obedience. You need to obey whether you like it or not. And this, I would say, is the culmination of 60 years of critical theory invading our societies. Because again, in order for the communist revolution to continue, they need to have people which are fertile ground for it to grow. And those people need to be accepting blindly of arbitrary authority which rests on nothing more than power. Now, am I saying this is some grand conspiracy? Well, I would say no, but at some point you have to have enough bad actors moving in one direction that it appears that they're moving in a cohesive way, even though they're not. And I would say, again, historically you can see this over and over again. If you look at many kinds of revolution, you'll see that all these revolutionaries look like they're presenting a united front until they get what they want. And then purges start, because they need to purge their own ranks because they don't agree with each other. They're just independent actors driving blindly, usually, in one direction. And I would say that's what we have right now. It's not a grand conspiracy, but you have enough bad actors moving in this one direction that it certainly appears to be so, even though it isn't. But I said I was going to talk about heroes. When am I going to get into the point of heroes? Well, that's now. Because the point is that this blind following of arbitrary authority, what does it really seek to do? At its heart, what is it? Well, at its heart, it is a way to kill your free will. It's saying that, no, you don't have the freedom to choose. You can't actually do that. You need to submit to this arbitrary authority and do what it says. At the very least, in any meaningful way that's going to govern your life. And the thing is, what is a hero? Well, a hero is a self-sacrificing individual. And tied up with all of that is included the notion that this hero is sacrificing for what? Well, he's sacrificing for a greater good. That greater good is dependent upon a truth, not upon arbitrary authority, but upon a greater principle that they hold to be true. And a sacrifice is saying, look, I realize I can't get X unless I sacrifice Y. Therefore, I'm going to give up Y in order to have X. And a self-sacrifice is saying, look, the thing I need to give up is part of me, or me entirely. I will give up part of me, or even all of me, in order to produce this greater good, in order to serve this greater truth. But the thing is, a self-sacrifice needs necessarily to be an act of the will. Those poor souls that were sacrificed, let's say, to the Incan gods because they were captives, they didn't sacrifice themselves willingly. Therefore, it wasn't a self-sacrifice. They didn't want to die. A self-sacrifice is where your will is behind it, saying, yes, I will give up everything, even my life, in order to serve this, in order to get to this greater good. And that is an act of the will, and such a great act of the will that it can only be fostered by having you train up your will throughout your life in a way that allows for this large act of the will. Or to put it another way, it is you over and over again making an act of the will in this direction in some small way, so that when it comes time to make this act of the will in a big way, you're ready to do so. But if you look at the world that is being built around us today, you will see that the future it wishes to bring about is a future without heroes. Why? Because again, they need blind obedience to an arbitrary authority, and that kills any meaningful act of the will on your part. Or in other words, this future that we see being set up before us, it has no heroes in it because it's a future where your will has been squashed by the boot of tyranny. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And yes, I know it's a frivolous thing to say after a video like this, but please consider clicking on the link in the description for the coming soon page for my graphic novel, just to check it out, see if it interests you in any way. Because supporting my work certainly does support me in my effort to actually be a dissenting voice to all that we see going on around us today. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye.